Okay, so apparently, while Americans were out there arguing about pineapple on pizza, archaeologists were quietly digging up the most absolutely unhinged stuff imaginable right underneath our feet. Like a 14-year-old girl's skull, proving colonists literally ate each other at Jamestown. A pyramid bigger than the Great Pyramid of Egypt hiding in Illinois that nobody talks about. And a government that secretly sprayed plague bacteria over an entire American city just to see what would happen. We've got 111 of these, and they only get more insane from here. So, if you've ever wanted to feel both horrified and weirdly proud to be American at the same time, smash that like button, subscribe so you don't miss part 2, and drop in the comments the one thing you think you already know about American history. Because I promise you, you don't. 1. Archaeologists digging in Illinois once stumbled upon something so disturbing that even the most seasoned scientists had to take a long coffee break afterward. Inside a burial mound at Cahokia, around 1050 AD, researchers found 53 young women strangled and arranged in perfectly neat rows like some kind of horrifying seating chart. All of them were killed in a single ceremony just to celebrate the founding of the city. Cahokia basically threw the world's most terrifying grand opening party, and nobody was handing out balloons. 2. In 1325 AD, somewhere in South Dakota, a group of people had the absolute worst day in recorded history. Archaeologists at Crow Creek uncovered a mass grave holding 486 bodies that were scalped, beheaded, and had their teeth knocked out before being dumped together. Why, scientists confirmed all 486 were processed the same way, like some kind of nightmare assembly line. South Dakota tourism has never once put this on a welcome sign, and honestly, that feels like a missed opportunity. 3. Scientists in Washington state pulled a 9,000-year-old skull from a riverbank and immediately regretted everything they thought they knew about American history. Kennewick Man, as they called him, had bone structure closer to ancient Japanese Ainu people than any Native American group ever recorded. Nobody ordered this plot twist. Researchers spent years arguing, tribes demanded the remains back, and courts got involved. One old skull basically caused a national identity crisis and filed for diplomatic immunity all at the same time. 4. Louisiana's Poverty Point was a massive thriving city built all the way back in 1700 BC, and archaeologists showed up expecting answers but found absolutely nothing useful. No graves, no weapons, no trash piles, no explanation for where thousands of people went. The entire population just vanished like they got a better offer somewhere else. Scientists have been digging for decades, and the site basically keeps saying, "Mind your business." It remains one of the greatest ghosting incidents in all of human history. 5. Someone in Colorado around 900 AD was cooking dinner, and archaeologists thousands of years later confirmed the main ingredient was other people. Cooking pots at the Anasazi site tested positive for human myoglobin, a protein only released when human muscle is boiled. These were not accident pots. They were dedicated human soup vessels used repeatedly. Archaeologists published the findings, the scientific community collectively lost their appetite, and Colorado tourism quietly updated their brochures to not mention this at all. 6. Florida is already a strange place, but 8,000 years ago it was apparently even stranger. At Windover Bog, archaeologists found 168 people buried upside down inside a pond, carefully wrapped in woven fabric so advanced it should not have existed yet. Scientists dated the textile work, and then had to sit down because nothing from that era anywhere on Earth came close to this level of craftsmanship. Ancient Florida man was apparently a skilled weaver who also had very unusual opinions about which direction people should face in death. 7. When construction crews dug under Lower Manhattan, they were not expecting a history lesson but got one anyway. The African burial ground revealed 419 enslaved Africans buried beneath New York City, with broken spines, fractured bones, and worn-down bodies that showed extreme forced labor. Children as young as 5 had the same damage patterns as adult laborers. New York City was literally built on top of this and paved a parking lot over it and called it a day until someone finally brought a shovel. 8. Alabama handed archaeologists one of the most uncomfortable discoveries in American medical history when unmarked mass graves appeared near the Tuskegee study site. Inside were black syphilis patients buried with no names, no markers, and no official records, disposed of by U.S. government contractors who apparently thought paperwork was optional. The men were never treated, never informed, and then never properly buried. The Tuskegee study is already infamous, but this particular chapter somehow made the whole thing even worse. 9. Off the Florida coast, scientists pulled up ancient human skulls and discovered something nobody had on their research bingo card. Preserved inside those 7,000-year-old bones was actual brain tissue, still partially intact after millennia underwater, making it the oldest brain matter ever recovered in the Americas. Researchers were thrilled. The brains were less thrilled. Apparently, the specific underwater chemistry of this Florida site created perfect preservation conditions that no laboratory has ever been able to fully replicate since. 10. Alaska delivered one of its coldest and most disturbing archaeological gifts when researchers found a 500-year-old ritually killed child frozen in the permafrost. Surrounding the small body were deliberately strangled puppies, arranged in a careful circle as ceremonial offerings. A scientist confirmed the placement was intentional and highly organized. The child and the puppies were all killed specifically for this ritual. Alaska already has a reputation for being intense, but this particular find pushed things into a category that required several new scientific vocabulary words. 11. Virginia colonists at Jamestown had a winter so brutal in 1609 that they made a decision nobody puts in the travel brochures. The Smithsonian confirmed through forensic analysis of a 14-year-old girl's skull that she was butchered and eaten by fellow colonists during the starving season. Cut marks on her bones showed careful, deliberate processing. Jamestown is taught in every American school as a story of survival and perseverance, which is technically accurate, just with some very significant details left out of the curriculum. 12. Nevada handed scientists a mummy so confusing that researchers had to take a long look at everything they thought they understood about early Americans. The Spirit Cave. Mummy was 10,600 years old, wearing expertly woven shoes, and carried DNA that matched absolutely no existing human population anywhere on Earth. Scientists ran the tests multiple times hoping for a different answer. The mummy just kept being mysterious. It essentially rewrote early American history while wearing better footwear than most people manage today. 13. Illinois contains a pyramid that quietly outclasses Egypt, and almost nobody outside of archaeology circles knows about it. Monk's Mound at Cahokia has a larger base volume than the Great Pyramid of Giza and was built entirely without wheels, metal tools, or any written language to coordinate the construction. Thousands of workers moved millions of cubic feet of dirt by hand over generations. Egypt gets all the documentaries and the tourism dollars, while Illinois just sits there with a bigger pyramid and absolutely zero marketing department. 14. New York City paved a parking lot, over 1,500 forgotten human beings, and went about its day for years. When construction crews finally dug up the lot, they found bodies from the 1790s yellow fever epidemic buried in a mass grave that the city had simply stopped thinking about. These were real residents of New York, dumped quickly during a health crisis, and then buried under asphalt and forgotten completely. New York has a reputation for moving fast, but this particular act of civic amnesia lasted over 200 years. 15. Ohio's giant serpent mound is already one of the strangest structures in America, but then astronomers made it considerably stranger. Researchers confirmed the mound is astronomically aligned to the exact date of a comet impact that struck the region in 256 AD, suggesting ancient people built an enormous earth sculpture specifically to commemorate a disaster from the sky. They had no telescopes, no written science, and no government grant funding. They just watched the sky, survived a comet, and then built a giant snake about it like reasonable people. 16. Colorado gave archaeologists one of the most disturbing military crime scenes ever uncovered on American soil. At Sand Creek, forensic teams confirmed that U.S. or Army soldiers in 1864 killed and scalped over 230 Cheyenne women and children, and then kept the skulls as personal trophies they carried home. These were not battlefield deaths. They were families in a camp. The soldiers were celebrated when they returned. Not a single one faced any criminal consequence, and several received formal commendations from the government shortly afterward. 17. Ohio's Newark earthworks is a geometric construction so mathematically precise that modern surveyors still struggle to fully explain how it was built. The entire complex encodes a complete 18.6-year lunar cycle with accuracy that modern astronomers have verified using satellite imaging. The people who built it had no known written mathematics, no calculators, and no university system. They just apparently understood the moon's orbital patterns well enough to build a massive landscape calculator out of dirt that still works perfectly over 1,000 years later. 18. Off the coast of Florida near the Bahamas sits an underwater stone road that has been quietly causing arguments among scientists for decades. The Bimini Road is a perfectly aligned formation of large stones sitting on the seafloor that may be up to 10,000 years old. No known civilization from that era is credited with building anything like it in that location. Scientists are divided, geologists disagree, and the stones just sit there underwater being perfectly arranged and refusing to explain themselves to anyone. 19. New Mexico archaeologists unsealed a room at Chaco Canyon and found it packed entirely with human skulls, all arranged to face a single precise astronomical direction. No matching bodies were found anywhere near the site. Just skulls, carefully placed, all looking the same direction at something in the sky that nobody alive today can identify. Chaco Canyon already had a reputation for being one of the most mysterious, ancient sites in North America, and this particular room arrived specifically to make that reputation significantly worse. 20. South Dakota confirmed what many historians already suspected, but nobody had physically proven until archaeologists arrived with ground-penetrating radar. At Wounded Knee, 300 Lakota Sioux were found buried in a mass trench after the 1890 massacre, with many showing bullet wounds in their backs, meaning they were shot while running away. The U.S. government had described the event in official records as a battle. The bones described it as something else entirely, and bones, it turns out, are considerably more honest than government paperwork. 21. Montana delivered a discovery so significant that scientists had to completely redraw the family tree of an entire continent. The Anzac child, a 12,700-year-old infant buried under a rock ledge, carried DNA that turned out to be the direct genetic ancestor of 80% of all Native Americans alive today. One tiny burial site in Montana essentially contained the origin story of hundreds of millions of people across 2 continents. Scientists were stunned. The infant had been dead for over 12,000 years and still managed to rewrite an entire field of human genetics. R22. Kentucky Lake is a perfectly normal reservoir until sonar equipment reveals something deeply inconvenient, sitting 80 feet below the surface. Researchers detected a grid of ancient stone walls on the lake bottom, possibly the remains of a pre-Columbian settlement that was simply drowned when the dam was built in the 1940s. Nobody checked before flooding it. Engineers just built the dam, filled it with water, and accidentally submerged an entire ancient settlement that archaeologists are now extremely frustrated they cannot properly excavate without draining a very large lake. 23. Pennsylvania produced the first confirmed case of biological warfare in American history, and it happened right near Fort Pitt in the 1700s. Mass graves containing Native American remains showed deliberate smallpox infection, are physically confirmed through bone analysis and historical documentation that described blankets being used as delivery mechanisms. This was not accidental exposure. It was a planned operation carried out by colonial officials who wrote about it in letters that historians later found in archives. The letters were shockingly casual about the whole arrangement. 24. Ohio's Hopewell people had funeral traditions that started normal and then took a significant turn. Researchers confirmed through residue analysis that the Hopewell cremated their dead at a precise 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit in massive ceremonial furnaces and then consumed the ash in ritual meals afterward. This was not accidental. The temperature precision and the consumption were both deliberate and repeated consistently across multiple sites. Ohio in 100 AD was apparently hosting ceremonies that no modern event planner would ever agree to coordinate regardless of the budget offered. 25. Alabama's Moundville site was already one of the most important archaeological locations in North America before researchers found something that made everyone deeply uncomfortable. Buried completely separately from any human bodies were piles of severed human hands, isolated and arranged as standalone ritual offerings with no accompanying remains anywhere nearby. No full bodies, no explanation, just hands. Scientists have debated the meaning for decades, and the hands have continued to provide zero clarification while remaining one of the strangest isolated discoveries at any Mississippian site ever excavated. 26. Philadelphia in 1793 was dealing with a yellow fever outbreak so catastrophic and so fast that burial crews stopped checking whether patients were actually dead before covering them with lime. A mass grave found under a city park confirmed hundreds of victims were interred so rapidly during the crisis that some showed physical evidence of being buried while still alive. The city was in full panic mode. The death carts ran constantly, and lime was considered close enough to certainty. Philadelphia has had a complicated relationship with this particular chapter of its history ever since. 27. Lake Michigan has a lot going on beneath its surface, and scientists were not prepared for what sonar equipment revealed 40 feet underwater. A circle of perfectly arranged stone pillars was sitting on the lake bottom, organized in a deliberate pattern consistent with ceremonial construction. One of the stones had a carved image of a mastodon on it, an animal extinct for over 10,000 years. Nobody has been able to explain who built it, when exactly it was submerged, or why the Midwest does not have 17 documentaries about this already. 28. Oklahoma spent a century insisting that the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre produced no mass graves until forensic archaeologists arrived in 2020 and found them anyway. Ground-penetrating radar and excavation confirmed multiple burial sites containing victims from the attack on the Greenwood District, one of the wealthiest black communities in America at the time. Official government records had stated no mass deaths occurred. The graves stated otherwise with considerable physical authority. Tulsa had been sitting on this evidence for 100 years while official documents called it a misunderstanding. 29. Montana produced a mummified man sealed inside a cave carrying tools made from materials that geologists confirmed do not exist anywhere within 2,000 miles of where he was found. Nobody has ever explained how he acquired them, what route brought those specific materials to that specific cave, or who he was trading with across impossible distances. The mummy offered no receipts, no travel diary, and no trade route evidence. He just showed up in Montana with impossible tools and has been making scientists quietly furious about it ever since. 30. So Georgia's Etowah Mounds was a thriving city of 10,000 people, right up until 1375 AD, when every single resident left simultaneously and someone burned the entire city from the inside outward in a deliberate and organized pattern. Archaeologists confirmed the burning sequence moved systematically inward, suggesting the destruction was ceremonial rather than accidental or caused by enemies. No war evidence, no disease markers, no drought data explains the departure. 10,000 people just collectively decided they were done, set everything on fire in a very specific order, and never came back. 31. Florida's St. Augustine has a colonial mystery so strange that historians have been quietly bothered by it for centuries. In 1565, over 100 Spanish colonists all died within the same single week, and no disease, poison, environmental cause, or attack has ever been identified to explain the simultaneous deaths. They just all died together on the same schedule like someone set a timer. Spanish records documented the deaths but offered zero explanation. Modern forensic analysis has found nothing conclusive. St. Augustine calls itself America's oldest city, and apparently also hosts America's oldest completely unsolved mass death event. 32. New Mexico archaeologists found elaborate turquoise mosaic masks covering the faces of ancient dead, and then immediately hit a logistical problem that nobody could explain. The turquoise came from mines 500 miles away, with zero evidence of any trade route, transport system, or middleman connecting the two locations. No roads, no campsites along the way, no tools dropped en route. Saw just turquoise that somehow traveled 500 miles and ended up decorating faces in the desert. Scientists have proposed many theories, and the turquoise has continued sitting in museums being completely unhelpful about the whole situation. 33. Nevada produced a battlefield burial, so forensically precise that researchers could reconstruct exactly how each warrior died 1,000 years later. At Tonopah, ancient warriors were found with their weapons still physically embedded in their bones, obsidian blades lodged at the exact angles of fatal strikes. Scientists could identify where each person was standing, which direction the attack came from, and what the final moments looked like. It was essentially a frozen crime scene from the year 1000 AD, and Nevada managed to preserve it perfectly without meaning to or knowing it was there. Ata 34. In 1950, the United States military flew over San Francisco Bay and secretly sprayed bacteria on the civilian population below to test how effectively a biological weapon would spread through a major American city. Nobody on the ground was warned, consulted, or informed afterward. Residents just breathed it in and went about their day. The operation was called Sea Spray and was confirmed decades later through declassified documents. San Francisco residents found out their own government had used them as test subjects, the same way they found out about most things, entirely by accident and very much after the fact. 35. The Gulf of Mexico is hiding something that completely reframes what scientists thought they understood about ancient North America. A 50,000-year-old cypress forest was found perfectly preserved and still standing underwater, roots anchored to the seafloor, trees intact, wood so well preserved that it still smells like fresh cypress when cut. This forest was alive and thriving on dry land during an era when the Gulf was a very different place. Scientists confirmed the age and then spent considerable time just processing the fact that an entire ancient forest had been sitting underwater this whole time, completely undisturbed. 36. Oklahoma's Spiro Mounds contained 700 years' worth of accumulated sacrificial activity and one sealed inner chamber that researchers described as unlike anything found at any other site in North America. Inside were trophy skulls taken from enemies, ritual offerings, and evidence of continuous ceremonial killing spanning centuries. The site functioned as a regional death cult headquarters for most of its existence. Oklahoma has many official state symbols and landmarks, and Spiro Mounds is technically among them, which becomes a more interesting fact the more you learn about what was happening inside it. 37. Florida state records officially claimed that nobody was killed during the 1923 destruction of Rosewood, a prosperous black community burned to the ground by a white mob. Forensic archaeologists then found hidden graves containing the remains of black victims that the state had simply never acknowledged existed. The graves were real. The bodies were real. The official records were not. South Florida spent decades teaching a version of this event that the physical evidence directly contradicted, and the graves had been sitting in the ground quietly waiting for someone to finally look in the right place. 38. New Mexico's Gran Quivira was a thriving city of 3,000 people until around 1670, when every single resident abandoned it completely overnight and never returned. Archaeologists found no evidence of war, drought, epidemic, or any external threat that would explain a total simultaneous departure of an entire urban population. Food stores were left behind. Structures were intact. Belongings remained. 3,000 people simply stopped living there all at once with no explanation attached. Our Gran Quivira has been sitting empty in the New Mexico desert for over 350 years and has still not offered any comment on what happened. 39. Montana's Blackfoot people drove bison off cliffs for centuries, and archaeologists found the receipts stacked 30 feet deep. At the base, the Blackfoot bison drive site contained bones from approximately 60,000 individual bison accumulated over generations of organized hunting. This was not casual survival. It was a large-scale coordinated operation repeated consistently across hundreds of years. The sheer volume of bones confirmed that pre-Columbian America contained organized industrial-scale food operations that most history textbooks describe in about one sentence before moving on to talk about something involving Europeans arriving with flags. 40. North Dakota produced a ceramic pot that functioned as a forensic time capsule nobody expected to find. Inside a sealed vessel, researchers discovered 40 preserved human scalps, and DNA testing confirmed they belonged to men, women, and children from 5 completely different tribal groups. This was not a single conflict trophy collection. It represented organized scalp taking across multiple communities over time, carefully preserved and stored together. The pot had been sitting sealed in the ground for centuries, holding evidence of a regional conflict history that no oral tradition or written record had ever fully documented or explained. 41. Arkansas produced one of the most unusual jewelry collections ever uncovered at any archaeological site in North America. At a single Cadouan burial site, researchers found over 200 women buried wearing necklaces made entirely from actual human finger bones and teeth taken from other people. This was not rare or exceptional within the site. It was the standard burial practice repeated consistently across hundreds of graves. Arkansas has produced many notable archaeological discoveries, but this particular fashion trend from ancient times has never once appeared on any state tourism promotional material for reasons that are fairly self-explanatory. 42. California's Tulare Lake dried up during the 2022 drought and immediately started confessing to things that had been hidden underwater for over 170 years. Exposed bones at the lake bed revealed hundreds of Yakuts people killed in an 1850s militia raid that appears in zero historical records, zero government documents, and zero official accounts of any kind. The massacre was simply never written down by anyone in authority. The lake had been holding the evidence underwater for over a century, and a severe drought did more investigative journalism in one season than historians managed in 170 years. 43. Texas produced stone tools that immediately made every archaeologist who studied them deeply uncomfortable about the established timeline of human arrival in America. Tools found at the Friedkin site date to 16,000 years ago, a full 2,500 years before humans were supposed to have arrived in North America according to the accepted scientific model. The tools match no known cultural tradition from any identified group. They just exist in Texas, 16,000 years old, completely unexplained, sitting in a layer of earth that according to the previous scientific consensus should contain absolutely nothing made by human hands. 44. New Mexico contains a road so perfectly engineered and so completely purposeless that it has frustrated archaeologists for decades. The Chaco Canyon Road stretches 400 miles in a perfectly straight line through empty desert, shows no evidence of foot traffic, carries no trade goods residue, and leads to absolutely nothing at either end. Building it required enormous coordinated labor across generations. Nobody knows why. The road just exists in the desert, mathematically perfect, historically inexplicable, and completely unbothered by the fact that every theory proposed to explain it has eventually fallen apart under scrutiny. 45. The Ohio burial mounds have produced strange discoveries before, but researchers were genuinely unprepared for what they found inside one particular mound near the state. Two complete skeletons had been deliberately sewn together at the shoulders, positioned facing opposite directions, and buried as a single intentional unit. No disease, no accident, no natural process explains the configuration. Somebody did this on purpose with considerable effort and then buried the results ceremonially. Ohio has thousands of burial mounds and most of them are mysterious, but this specific one arrived with a level of deliberate strangeness that placed it in its own separate category entirely. 46. The American Southwest produced a collection so geographically impossible that researchers had to triple-check their location data before publishing. The 75 trophy heads displayed in the distinctive style of the Wari Empire of Peru were found buried in the American Southwest, thousands of miles from the Wari's known territory. The Wari have no other confirmed presence anywhere in North America. No trade connection, no migration path, no contact evidence links them to this location. The heads just showed up in the wrong continent with Peruvian cultural markers attached and zero explanation for how they crossed the geographic gap. 47. Philadelphia's Holmesburg Prison ran what researchers later confirmed was one of the longest and most extensive illegal human experimentation programs in American history. For decades, inmates were subjected to chemical tests, dermatological experiments, and pharmaceutical trials without consent or full disclosure of risks involved. The experiments were confirmed not through whistleblowers, but through the published academic papers of the university researchers who proudly documented their own work. The scientists wrote it all down, published it in journals, and apparently assumed nobody would eventually read those journals and find the situation problematic. 48. Florida's waters. off the dry Tortugas are hiding a shipwreck that matches absolutely no historical record anywhere in any archive ever searched. The wreck contained 40 shackled skeletons below deck, 200 loaded muskets ready to fire, and 4 tons of live gunpowder still packed in barrels. No ship matching that cargo configuration, that hull design, or that location appears in any port record, naval registry, or insurance document from any nation. The ship existed. It clearly transported people in chains with an arsenal aboard, and then sank, and was simply never reported missing by anyone responsible for it. 49. Louisiana's Natchez tribe had a leadership transition tradition that archaeologists confirmed was exactly as extreme as historical accounts had described. When a Natchez chief died, over 30 of his wives, servants, and personal guards were strangled and buried alongside him in a single organized event. This was not rumor or colonial exaggeration. Physical evidence confirmed the simultaneous deaths and the deliberate burial arrangement. The Natchez chief essentially had a departure ceremony that required his entire, immediate household staff to also immediately stop having futures, which represented an extremely demanding employment situation by any historical standard. 50. South Dakota produced a U.S. Army record book that turned an already horrifying historical event into something considerably more documented and damning. The ledger cataloged scalps taken from Native women and children by individually named soldiers who kept them as personal collectibles following the Wounded Knee massacre. Names, dates, and descriptions were recorded with bureaucratic precision. Not one soldier listed in the ledger ever faced any legal consequence. The document was found in South Dakota, filed away in a collection of military papers, sitting quietly among routine administrative records as though it described something entirely ordinary. 51. New York's Staten Island housed an institution called Willowbrook, where children with disabilities lived, and researchers confirmed that doctors there deliberately infected those children with hepatitis as part of illegal medical experiments. The experiments ran for years with internal records kept that investigators later uncovered in the institution's own filing system. Parents were sometimes told the infections were accidental. The researchers published findings in academic journals. Willowbrook was a state-run facility, meaning New York taxpayers were technically funding a program that used disabled children as hepatitis test subjects without their knowledge or consent. 52. Nova Scotia's Oak Island has been famous for treasure hunting for centuries, but DNA results from human bone fragments pulled from deep inside the money pit shaft reframed the entire mystery. The bones were over 1,000 years old, and testing revealed 2 completely separate ancient populations, one with Mediterranean genetic origins and one with Middle Eastern markers. Nobody from either of those populations was supposed to be anywhere near Nova Scotia 1,000 years ago. Oak Island has frustrated treasure hunters for generations, but the bones quietly suggested the real discovery was never about gold at all. 53. Florida produced a wooden figure so strange and so perfectly preserved that researchers spent considerable time debating whether the tools used to carve it actually existed in Florida at all. The Key Marco Catman, half cat and half human in design, was found in a swamp with its paint still intact and its details still sharp after centuries underwater. Site analysis confirmed it was carved using techniques and tools that no known Florida culture ever demonstrably possessed. The figure just showed up in a swamp, beautifully made, completely anomalous, and has been staring at museum visitors with its cat face ever since. 54. Charleston produced a mass grave containing 36 enslaved Africans, who all died of the same, unidentified disease within days of each other, and their owners never reported a single death to any authority whatsoever. No death certificates, no official records, no documentation of any kind was filed. 36 people died simultaneously, and the response from those responsible was to bury them quietly and say nothing to anyone. The disease that killed them has never been conclusively identified. The owners face no consequences. Charleston archaeologists found the grave centuries later entirely by accident during routine construction work. 55. Florida contains the earliest confirmed ritual site found anywhere in North America, and it is sitting at the bottom of a sinkhole near Tallahassee. 7,000-year-old human remains were found alongside wooden stakes, and animal bones, arranged in patterns that researchers confirmed were deliberate and ceremonial rather than accidental. The site predates every other confirmed ritual location in the Americas by a significant margin. Florida has a reputation for producing strange news on a daily basis, but this particular sinkhole managed to produce strange news that was 7,000 years old and still somehow felt completely on brand for the state. 56. Then California's Angel Island processed thousands of Chinese immigrants through its detention facilities, and government records officially stated that all detainees were either admitted or deported with no deaths recorded on the island. Archaeologists then found unmarked graves of Chinese immigrants who died during detention, physically disproving the official record with considerable directness. People died there, were buried there, and the government simply chose not to write it down. The graves existed on an island surrounded by water, which made them considerably harder to accidentally overlook than a standard bureaucratic omission might suggest. 57. Minnesota produced a 9,000-year-old female skeleton that immediately complicated every existing map of how humans first arrived in the Americas. A Minnesota woman carried genetic markers linking her directly to Siberia, but via a completely separate migration route from anything scientists had previously identified or theorized. She did not fit the established model. She did not fit any revised model either. She just existed in Minnesota 9,000 years ago, having arrived through a pathway that researchers are still working to identify, which is impressive for someone who has been dead for 9 millennia and never filed a travel itinerary. 58. Georgia contains a 1,000-year-old underground council chamber that archaeologists found so perfectly preserved they could see exactly where 50 people had been sitting. The Ocmulgee Earth Lodge still holds the foot impressions of its last occupants pressed into the clay floor in a ceremonial circle, frozen in place for 10 centuries. The scientists could count the seats, measure the spacing, and identify the central ceremonial position. The last people to use that chamber walked out one day, and the floor kept their footprints permanently. Georgia then built a suburb nearby, and the footprints just waited underground for someone to eventually notice them. 59. California's oldest confirmed human resident was a woman whose skull was found deliberately shattered before her burial 9,000 years ago, and forensic analysis confirmed the crushing was intentional rather than accidental, or caused by soil pressure over time. La Brea woman was carefully buried, which suggests she was valued by her community, but also had her skull crushed before placement, which complicates that interpretation considerably. Researchers have proposed multiple explanations across decades of study, and none has achieved scientific consensus. She remains the oldest Californian on record, and also the most forensically confusing one by a significant margin. 60. Tennessee contains a natural cave that served as a community burial chamber for exactly 1,000 consecutive years, and later generations solved the space problem by burying their dead directly on top of earlier ones. Archaeologists found 6 distinct layers of human remains stacked inside, representing a continuous multi-generational commitment to using the same cave regardless of how occupied it was already getting. The oldest remains at the bottom date back thousands of years. The community kept returning, kept adding layers, and kept treating this particular cave as the correct and only appropriate place to put their dead for 10 straight centuries. 61. Illinois prisoners at Stateville Penitentiary in the 1940s were deliberately infected with malaria by government researchers who apparently decided that informed consent was an optional part of the scientific process. The experiments ran for years with prisoners receiving infected mosquito bites under controlled conditions, while researchers recorded the results. Most inmates were never told what had been done to their bodies or what long-term effects they might experience. The program was government-funded, university-administered, and generated published research that scientists cited for decades afterward, without anyone involved expressing particular concern about how the subjects were recruited. War 62. Virginia's Chesapeake Bay is hiding an entire native village on its floor that sonar equipment and archaeological sampling confirmed was swallowed by rising water around 1000 AD. The village did not burn, was not attacked, and was not abandoned by choice. The water simply rose gradually and covered everything while the community presumably relocated and watched their former home disappear beneath the bay. Researchers confirmed structural remains, cultural artifacts, and settlement patterns consistent with a thriving community. The Chesapeake Bay has been sailing and fishing territory for centuries, and nobody realized there was a village underneath the whole time. 63. Tennessee produced the first physical confirmation that Mississippian culture practiced ritual prisoner burning. And it arrived in the form of charred human wrist bones still attached to a burned wooden post found at an excavation site. Before this discovery, researchers had oral accounts and artistic depictions suggesting the practice existed. The bones confirmed it with considerably more authority than artwork alone. One set of wrist bones attached to one burned post transformed a historical theory into a historical fact, and Tennessee added another entry to its already extensive list of archaeological discoveries that require a moment of silence before discussing. 64. Los Angeles has a documented history of civic record destruction, and the 1871 Chinese massacre site confirmed it with forensic authority. Archaeology verified that 19 Chinese immigrants were publicly killed and dismembered in downtown Los Angeles while city officials watched. The actual death toll was recorded in documents that were later deliberately destroyed by city administrators. Researchers confirmed both the killings and the deliberate elimination of accurate records through cross-referencing surviving witness accounts with physical evidence. Los Angeles occasionally describes its history as complicated, and this particular episode is one of the primary reasons that description remains the understatement of several consecutive centuries. 65. Alaska handed geneticists one of their most significant finds when a 10,300-year-old skeleton in On Your Knees cave produced DNA, proving he was the direct ancestor of the Tlingit people. This pushed the confirmed arrival of Tlingit ancestors in Alaska back by thousands of years beyond what any previous evidence had established. The Tlingit oral tradition had always described deep roots in the region. Scientists spent decades being skeptical about those claims. One skeleton in one cave in Alaska then confirmed the oral tradition was correct, and the skepticism was the part that needed revising. 66. New Orleans buried 8,000 yellow fever victims in mass trench graves during a single summer in 1853, and did it so rapidly that physical evidence confirmed some individuals were covered with earth before they had actually finished dying. The death rate during that summer exceeded the city's entire burial infrastructure, and crews simply could not slow down enough to verify each case individually. New Orleans has a famously complicated relationship with death, burial, and the management of remains generally, and the summer of 1853 represents the single most concentrated expression of that complicated relationship in the city's entire recorded history. 67. Wisconsin's effigy mounds are already one of the stranger archaeological features of the American Midwest, but researchers added another layer of strangeness when they confirmed that hundreds of animal-shaped burial mounds all have their carved eyes oriented toward the same specific star. The star in question is not associated with death, navigation, or ceremony in any known Native American tradition from the surrounding region. Nobody has identified which culture made this astronomical choice or why that particular star was selected. The mounds just keep pointing their carved eyes at the same spot in the sky and declining to elaborate on their reasoning. 68. Texas experienced its deadliest natural disaster in 1900 when a hurricane killed 8,000 people overnight in Galveston, and the city discovered that ocean disposal of that many bodies was not a permanent solution. The remains washed back to shore, repeatedly forcing Galveston to pivot to public beach bonfires as the primary disposal method. Residents built massive fires along the shoreline and burned bodies in full public view for days while the city attempted to return to functional operations simultaneously. Galveston rebuilt itself after the hurricane and became a beach resort destination, which is an impressive rebranding effort given what those beaches were used for immediately afterward. 69. Colorado's Mesa Verde. Cliff dwellings contain a sealed room that has produced one of the most quietly unsettling mysteries in southwestern archaeology. The room was sealed from the outside, with one living person locked inside, surrounded by untouched food supplies that suggest they did not die of starvation. No disease markers explain the death. No injury was detected. The cause of death has never been determined, and the reason for the sealing has never been identified. Someone decided this particular person needed to be locked in a room with plenty of food and then sealed the door from outside, and the explanation for that decision is completely gone. 70. Alabama's Fort Mims. Massacre in 1813 left enough physical evidence that forensic archaeologists could reconstruct the sequence of deaths during the Creek warrior attack with disturbing precision. Bone analysis of the remains confirmed that children were killed before their parents based on the physical location and layering of remains found throughout the ruins. Researchers could identify movement patterns, defensive positions, and the order in which different groups were reached. Fort Mims is a well-documented historical event, but the forensic reconstruction added a level of specific detail that transformed a historical record into something considerably more difficult to read. 71. The San Francisco's 1900 bubonic plague outbreak was handled by the city government with a strategy that combined active denial with targeted discrimination. A mass grave from the outbreak was secretly buried under Chinatown, while officials publicly insisted no plague existed in the city at all. The quarantine they did implement applied exclusively to Chinese residents despite the disease spreading throughout the broader population. Decades later, archaeologists confirmed the burial site that records never acknowledged. San Francisco managed to simultaneously deny a plague, bury its victims secretly, and blame a single ethnic community for an outbreak it was officially pretending was not happening. 72. Why did Tennessee produced a sealed archaeological cache so unusual that researchers initially struggled to find any comparable discovery at any other Mississippian site in North America? 80 individual copper death masks were found inside a burial mound, each depicting a different and distinct human face with specific individual features carefully crafted into the metal. None of the faces matched any skull recovered anywhere at the site. 80 portraits of people whose remains were never found, preserved in copper inside a mound in Tennessee, staring up at archaeologists who had absolutely no framework for explaining what they were looking at or who commissioned it. 73. California's San Gabriel Mission sits on top of over 6,000 Native American burials, and forensic analysis of the bones transformed the standard historical narrative about mission life into something considerably darker. Bone stress markers on the remains showed that the majority of those buried died from overwork, rather than from introduced diseases as mission records had traditionally claimed. The physical evidence of forced labor was written directly into the skeletons in ways that could not be reinterpreted or explained away. Los Angeles was built on the labor of people whose bones then recorded the cost of that labor in permanent biological detail underground. 74. So Florida produced a mastodon tusk with human butcher marks on it that immediately pushed the confirmed timeline of humans in America back by 1,500 years in a single discovery. The Page-Ladson tusk was pulled from a Florida river and dated to 14,550 years ago, meaning people were processing mastodon carcasses in Florida over 2,000 years before the accepted arrival date for humans in North America. Scientists ran the dating multiple times hoping for a different answer. Florida, a state famous for producing unexpected and uncomfortable surprises, managed to produce one that was 14,000 years old and still somehow felt ahead of schedule. 75. Wisconsin contains a Cahokia-influenced archaeological site that raises serious geographic questions about how far that civilization's cultural reach actually extended. Noaztaland's burial mound contained remains exclusively of women showing clear signs of violent sacrifice, built by people who carried Cahokia's cultural practices 1,200 miles north of Cahokia's main center in Illinois. Nobody has fully explained the mechanism by which Cahokia's sacrificial traditions traveled that distance and established themselves in Wisconsin. Aztalan just sits in the Wisconsin landscape, being a Cahokia outpost that nobody sent a memo about and that mainstream history textbooks cover in approximately one paragraph, if at all. 76. Brazil produced a 12,000-year-old skull that has been making physical anthropologists deeply uncomfortable since the moment it was analyzed. A Luzia woman had bone structure indistinguishable from ancient sub-Saharan African populations, despite being found in the Americas at a time when no contact between these regions was supposed to exist. She predates any accepted model of African presence in the Western Hemisphere by thousands of years. Scientists have proposed multiple migration theories attempting to explain her existence without rewriting everything. Lucia has been in a Brazilian museum this entire time, being completely unbothered by how much scientific discomfort her cheekbones have caused internationally. 77. The Gulf of Mexico is concealing an entire ancient river valley 300 feet below its surface, complete with preserved banks, ancient trees, and confirmed evidence of human habitation along its shores 15,000 years ago. Always sonar mapping revealed the full valley system sitting perfectly preserved on the seafloor, where it was gradually drowned as sea levels rose after the last ice age. People lived, fished, and built communities along those riverbanks for generations before the water came. The Gulf of Mexico is one of the most heavily trafficked bodies of water in the world, and it has been hiding an entire drowned civilization underneath boat traffic the entire time. 78. Tennessee's Trail of Tears. Route contains mass graves where Cherokee people were buried without ceremony, without markers, and often 10 individuals to a single hole during the forced government march of 1838. Archaeologists confirmed the burial conditions through excavation along the documented route, finding remains that showed no preparation, no grave goods, and no individual treatment of any kind. The United States government organized and executed the march, tracked its logistics meticulously in official records, and somehow produced no documentation of where thousands of people who died during it were actually put into the ground. 79. California's Channel Islands produced a 13,000-year-old skeleton whose diet told a story that rewrote the accepted timeline of maritime civilization in the Americas. Arlington man ate exclusively ocean seafood his entire life, confirmed through isotope analysis of his bones, proving that a fully developed maritime culture existed on the California coast thousands of years earlier than any textbook had previously acknowledged. He was not an inland person who occasionally visited the coast. He lived entirely on the ocean's resources from birth. California was apparently hosting sophisticated coastal civilizations during an era when the standard history curriculum insists nobody particularly organized was around yet. 80. Utah's Mountain Meadows Massacre in 1857 produced 29 skeletons that forensic analysis turned into a direct contradiction of every official account the militia members had given about what happened that day. Gunshot wounds in the bones proved conclusively that militia members killed survivors after promising them safe passage out of the area. The physical wounds matched execution-style positioning rather than combat injuries. Militia leaders had claimed for years that only Native Americans were responsible for the deaths. The skeletons disagreed with that account in very specific anatomical detail that no amount of subsequent official testimony was able to reframe or explain away. 81. Florida's Key West holds an underwater grave site connected to the slave ship Guerrero, which sank in 1827 carrying 561 Africans toward a life of forced labor. The U.S. Navy rescued survivors but buried 294 people who died in the wreck in unmarked pits, whose locations were never officially recorded by any government authority. The United States government documented the rescue operation in considerable detail, and somehow found the paperwork for every other aspect of the incident, except where nearly 300 human beings were actually placed into the ground afterward. 82. But California contains a sealed cave whose interior paintings only become visually coherent on a single specific day of the entire year. The Chumash-painted cave artwork only makes complete visual sense when winter solstice sunlight strikes the paintings at the exact required angle, activating the full design in a way that no other lighting condition produces. Someone painted an image that requires a specific astronomical event to be fully seen, buried it in a cave, and left no instructions. California has been sitting on this for 1,000 years, and it still only works correctly once annually, on the exact day it was designed for. 83. The Natchez Trace was one of early America's most important travel corridors, and forensic examination of remains found along its route revealed it was also one of the most consistently dangerous. Bones recovered along the old road showed knife marks and injury patterns consistent with systematic robbery and murder, carried out by organized gangs operating along the route for decades. The wounds were not random. They matched the pattern of staged ambushes targeting travelers at predictable choke points. The Natchez Trace is now a scenic national parkway with a very pleasant speed limit and absolutely no interpretive signage about the systematic killing operation it hosted for years. 84. Florida's Fort Jefferson sits on a remote island in the Gulf of Mexico, and during the Civil War, it held prisoners without trial who then died of yellow fever in considerable numbers. The U.S. military buried them in unmarked graves on the island and then destroyed the burial records, or eliminating documentation of both the deaths and the locations of the remains. Fort Jefferson is now a national monument visited by tourists who arrive by seaplane and snorkel around its walls without being informed that the island contains an unknown number of unrecorded graves from an extrajudicial detention program the military preferred not to document. 85. Pennsylvania's Eastern State Penitentiary was one of America's most famous prisons, and when construction crews began renovation work, they found sealed underground pits beneath the facility containing human remains with no records attached to them anywhere in the institution's filing system. The penitentiary had officially denied that any deaths occurred on site for decades across multiple administrative periods. The sealed pits containing actual human remains expressed a different position on that claim. Eastern State is now a tourist attraction and Halloween haunted house destination, which means thousands of people pay money annually to be scared inside a building that has confirmed unrecorded human remains underneath it. 86. Montana's Libby was a mining town where the W.R. Grace Company extracted vermiculite for decades, while concealing from regulators that the deposit was heavily contaminated with asbestos. Hundreds of residents died from exposure-related illness, and forensic archaeologists confirmed a mass medical cemetery of victims whose deaths the company had actively worked to hide from public health authorities for over 30 years. Grace documented the health data internally and continued operations. Libby residents were breathing contaminated air, while a corporation filed paperwork specifically designed to ensure nobody with regulatory authority would ever read the health statistics being quietly generated. 87. Montana's Anzac burial site contained something that connected a 12,700-year-old infant in America to burial traditions on the opposite side of the Pacific Ocean. The grave was packed with 100 stone and bone tools all coated in red ochre, using a specific ritual application method that matched burial practices found in ancient Northeast Asia with striking precision. The coating was not accidental coloring. It was deliberate ceremonial preparation using the same technique documented across the Pacific. One infant burial in Montana contained enough ritual detail to suggest a cultural connection, spanning an ocean that nobody had previously mapped or confirmed through any other evidence. 88. North Dakota's Mandan people lost 90% of their population to smallpox in 1837, and the entire catastrophe was traced back to a single infected passenger on the fur trade steamboat St. Peter. The village of approximately 2,000 people collapsed within weeks of the ship's arrival. Archaeologists and historians confirmed the transmission chain through combination of bone analysis, eyewitness accounts, and ship records. The St. Peter continued its route after stopping at the Mandan village, carrying the infection further along the river to additional communities. One steamboat passenger essentially ended a civilization in the time it takes to complete a routine commercial delivery run. 89. Georgia's Etowah site produced copper plates depicting elaborately costumed warriors performing detailed ceremonial activities, and researchers confirmed that every costume element, every symbol, and every ritual gesture shown on the plates matches no recorded Native American cultural tradition from any region surrounding Etowah. The warriors are doing something specific and meaningful that nobody alive can identify. The symbols reference a belief system that left no other surviving record anywhere. Etowah's copper plates have been studied for over a century by specialists in southeastern archaeology, and the figures on them are still performing ceremonies that the entire field of anthropology cannot currently name or explain. 90. Alabama's Russell Cave contains 10,000 years of continuous human burials stacked in layers inside a single cave system, making it one of the longest unbroken records of human habitation ever discovered anywhere in North America. Generation after generation returned to this specific cave to bury their dead across a time span longer than all of recorded human history combined. The cave was used continuously from before the Egyptian pyramids were built until after the Roman Empire collapsed and beyond. Our Alabama has a cave that witnessed more consecutive human history than most of the world's famous ancient monuments, and it sits quietly in the northeastern corner of the state, without a major motion picture about it. 91. Louisiana's Poverty Point trade network moved raw materials across the entire North American continent 3,000 years ago. An archaeologist confirmed it without being able to explain a single logistical detail of how it actually functioned. Copper from the Great Lakes, flint from the Ozarks, and stone from the Appalachians all arrived at Poverty Point with no wheels, no confirmed pack animals, no boats with documented cargo, and no written exchange records of any kind. The materials just kept arriving from thousands of miles away for centuries. See, Poverty Point essentially ran a continental import business with zero infrastructure that modern economists can identify, and zero paperwork that modern accountants can audit. 92. Georgia's Chickamauga battlefield gave construction workers in 1990 an unexpected history lesson when excavation uncovered a mass burial pit containing unidentified soldiers buried without any markers or official documentation. Military records for the location had been deliberately classified to avoid political controversy, meaning the U.S. government knew the pit existed and specifically chose to keep that information away from the public for decades. Chickamauga is one of the most visited Civil War battlefield sites in America. Then tourists have been walking over an officially suppressed mass grave for generations, while reading informational plaques that did not mention it was there. 93. Arizona's Grand Canyon contains deep cave systems that held 2,000-year-old human burials, accompanied by split-twig animal figurines placed in a very specific configuration. Each figurine was positioned still holding a tiny handmade spear aimed directly at the body of the deceased person buried alongside it. Researchers confirmed the positioning was deliberate and consistent across multiple burial sites within the cave system. Someone spent considerable time crafting miniature armed figurines and then arranged them specifically to threaten the dead. The Grand Canyon attracts 5 million visitors annually, and most of them are unaware that its interior caves contain tiny spear-wielding figures guarding ancient graves. 94. Washington State's coast produced a mammoth rib with a projectile point embedded in it that pushed the confirmed timeline of Pacific Coast big game hunting back by thousands of years in a single discovery. The point dated to 13,800 years ago, meaning humans were actively hunting large mammals on the Pacific coast during an era when the standard archaeological model insisted the coast was not yet significantly populated. The mammoth did not embed a spear point in its own rib. A human did that 13,800 years ago on a Washington beach, thousands of years before the history books scheduled anyone to be there doing it. 95. South Carolina's Topper site contains stone tools buried 15 feet below the Clovis cultural layer that date to 50,000 years ago, which would place human presence in America during the same era that Neanderthals were still living in Europe. Mainstream archaeology has treated this finding with extreme caution because accepting it requires dismantling virtually every established model of human migration into the Americas simultaneously. The tools exist in the ground at a confirmed depth with confirmed dating. South Carolina is technically sitting on evidence that could rewrite the entire human story in the Americas, and the scientific community is still very carefully deciding how to feel about that. 96. Oklahoma's Spiro Mound's inner chamber was cracked open in 1935, and what happened next remains one of the greatest archaeological disasters in American history. Looters destroyed irreplaceable carved shells, copper masks, and 700 years' worth of accumulated burial offerings before a single professional archaeologist arrived on the scene. Items were sold, scattered, and lost across private collections permanently. Researchers who eventually gained access found a chamber that had been systematically emptied and damaged beyond full reconstruction. Oklahoma had the most significant sealed ceremonial deposit ever found in North America and turned it into a looting event that the archaeological community has been grieving professionally for nearly 90 years. 97. Missouri produced physical proof that humans and mastodons occupied the same territory simultaneously and that humans were actively hunting them, settling a long-running scientific debate with a single discovery. At the Kimswick bone bed, human spear points were found directly alongside mastodon bones in the same undisturbed geological layer with no possibility of separate deposition. People and mastodons were in Missouri at the same time, and the humans were the ones doing the hunting. This confirmed what many researchers had theorized but could not physically prove, and what several other researchers had spent careers arguing against with considerable professional investment in being correct. 98. Our Illinois' Cahokia produced a single burial so elaborate that archaeologists needed significant time just to document everything present in the grave before they could begin analyzing it. One ruler was buried lying on a cloak made of exactly 20,000 individually drilled shell beads arranged in the precise shape of a falcon. Beneath him were 6 separate layers of sacrificed men stacked in the burial pit. The shell cloak alone represented an extraordinary investment of labor. The 6 layers of people underneath represented something that Cahokia's leadership apparently considered a completely standard component of a proper burial for someone important enough to wear 20,000 shells. 99. Ohio produced carved stones with ancient Hebrew text found buried deep inside burial mounds in 1860, and the debate about whether they are authentic has never been fully resolved by anyone with sufficient authority to end it. If the Newark Holy Stones are genuine, they demonstrate pre-Columbian contact between ancient Hebrew speakers and Ohio's mound builders, rewriting the entire established history of the Americas. If they are forgeries, they are remarkably sophisticated ones that have survived expert scrutiny for over 160 years. Ohio has been sitting with this unresolved controversy since before the Civil War, and both sides of the argument remain equally convinced and equally frustrated. 100. Nauy, Ohio's Fort Ancient archaeological site contains a layer of sudden catastrophic abandonment around 1350 AD that matches both the timeline and confirmed location of a cosmic airburst event that scientists have independently verified through geological evidence. The community did not leave gradually. Everything stopped at once. Researchers cross-referenced the abandonment layer with cosmic impact data and found the correlation precise enough to suggest the population either witnessed or was directly affected by a significant event falling from the sky. Ohio has 2 separate ancient sites connected to things falling from space, and has somehow never made this the centerpiece of a major tourism campaign. 101. New Mexico's 1847 Taos Pueblo revolt produced forensic evidence that directly contradicted the sanitized official military accounts written immediately afterward. Excavation at the site confirmed that U.S. Army artillery was fired directly into a church packed with hundreds of civilians who had taken refuge inside, believing the structure would protect them. The bones showed blast injuries consistent with artillery rounds fired at close range into an enclosed space. The Army's official reports described the operation as a military engagement. The skeletons inside the church walls described it as something the military terminology of the era was specifically designed not to say out loud. 102. Mississippi's Vicksburg Siege of 1863 is one of the most documented military campaigns in American history, and somehow nobody officially recorded that civilian families were suffocating underground during it. Archaeologists discovered a network of tunnel shelters beneath the city containing skeletons of families who had dug into the earth to survive the bombardment and never came back out. The deaths were never reported in any official record, military or civilian. Vicksburg kept detailed logs of ammunition expenditure, officer movements, and supply inventories during the entire siege, and apparently found the paperwork for everything except the families dying in tunnels directly underneath the record keepers. 103. The Illinois' Cahokia built a massive defensive wooden palisade wall around its city center, and archaeologists confirmed it was not a one-time construction project, but a repeated emergency response. Evidence showed the wall was rebuilt at least 3 separate times after fire destruction, meaning Cahokia was attacked seriously enough to burn its primary defensive structure on multiple occasions across its history. The city that built a pyramid bigger than Egypt's, organized continent-spanning trade networks, and conducted elaborate astronomical ceremonies was also under sustained enough military threat to keep rebuilding its burned walls, and apparently never fully resolved whoever kept setting them on fire. 104. Colorado's Mesa. Verde cliff dwellings contain sealed tower rooms that produced one of the most uncomfortable discoveries in southwestern archaeology when researchers found human remains inside with no burial preparation of any kind. The bodies showed no grave goods, no ceremonial placement, and no intentional arrangement suggesting planned interment. People died in those rooms suddenly and were sealed inside without any of the ritual treatment that ancestral Puebloan culture consistently applied to its dead everywhere else. Whatever happened in those tower rooms happened fast enough that the community either could not or deliberately chose not to follow any of its own burial traditions before sealing the doors permanently. 105. Michigan's Lake Superior shoreline contains ancient copper mining pits, representing over 5,000 years of industrial-scale metal extraction, carried out by a civilization that left almost no other archaeological trace of its existence anywhere. Researchers confirmed the mining was systematic, large-scale, and sustained across 5 millennia. Hundreds of tons of copper were removed from these sites. That copper went somewhere, was used by someone, and was traded across a network that connected to communities across the continent. The miners themselves left behind their pits, their tools, and absolutely nothing else that would identify who they were, where they lived, or where they ultimately disappeared to. 106. New Mexico contains a sealed cave chamber with 800-year-old handprints painted in human blood surrounding a central human skull placed deliberately on a stone altar. Researchers confirmed the blood origin through chemical analysis and the intentional arrangement through the consistent positioning pattern repeated across the chamber walls. Someone collected human blood, used it as paint, covered a cave in handprints, placed a skull on a stone, and sealed the chamber. New Mexico has an extraordinary concentration of ancient mystery sites, and this particular cave managed to stand out from that already remarkable competition by combining several categories of disturbing discovery into one sealed underground room. 107. Colorado's Crow Canyon burials contained a discovery that added a deeply strange detail to what was already a violent archaeological record. Bodies were found deliberately decapitated before burial, which was unusual enough, but in several individual cases someone had placed a completely different person's skull with the body instead of the deceased person's own head. The substitution was deliberate and consistent across multiple burials. Researchers confirmed the skulls did not belong to the bodies they were buried with through skeletal analysis. Someone in ancient Colorado had a specific practice of burying people with the wrong heads and has left absolutely no explanation for why that seemed like the correct approach. 108. Alaska's Tlingit culture maintained carved posts that oral tradition described as functional execution devices used at potlatch ceremonies, and archaeologists confirmed the oral history was entirely accurate through bone analysis and physical examination of the posts themselves. Enslaved people were killed at these ceremonies using the carved structures in a practice that combined public display, ritual significance, and social hierarchy demonstrations simultaneously. The Tlingit oral tradition had preserved accurate memory of this practice across generations without written records. Archaeologists spent years treating the oral accounts as mythology before the physical evidence arrived and firmly suggested that the oral tradition had been correct the entire time. 109. Kentucky's Cumberland Gap Pass produced forensic remains revealing a systematic ambush of an entire family group traveling through the narrow mountain passage centuries ago. Bone analysis confirmed violent deaths consistent with organized attack rather than accidental encounter, and evidence suggested survivors were recaptured and brought back to the ambush site after attempting to flee. The Cumberland Gap is famous as the passage Daniel Boone cleared through the Appalachians and celebrated as the gateway that opened America's westward expansion. It was apparently also functioning as an organized killing corridor for travelers, long before it became a symbol of American frontier mythology and national park signage. 110. Arkansas produced naturally mummified human remains in sealed Ozark cave systems, so well preserved after 2,000 years that researchers could examine hair color, skin texture, and clothing construction in detail. The mummies were entirely unknown to any local oral tradition from any surrounding community. Nobody remembered them, claimed them, or had any cultural memory of the people who had been placed in those caves 2,000 years ago. The caves preserved these individuals in extraordinary physical detail, while simultaneously preserving zero information about who they were, what culture they belonged to, or why their existence was completely erased from every regional memory tradition that survived into the modern era. 111. Louisiana's Poverty Point moved raw materials across an entire continent 3,000 years ago using transportation methods that archaeologists still cannot confirm. And the bird-shaped mound at its center was confirmed to have been raised with extraordinary speed relative to its enormous size. Its orientation precisely tracks the solstice sunrise across the horizon, meaning the entire massive structure was aligned to an astronomical event before the first basket of dirt was placed. Poverty Point built a continent-spanning trading empire, constructed precision astronomical monuments, housed thousands of residents, and then vanished without leaving a single grave, a single weapon, or a single explanation. America's most mysterious ancient city started with a bird and ended with silence. America is literally built on secrets, and archaeologists keep finding every single one of them. If this video broke your brain, hit like, subscribe to Dumb History, and drop a comment telling us which discovery shocked you the most. Now go click that next video because we are just getting started.